After 22 years in the army, most of them spent managing the kind of chaos that made civilians cry, I thought I'd earned peace. That's what Willowbrook Estates promised: peace, order, and a quiet place to retire with my books, my tools, and my ducks. Yes, ducks. 13 of them, all rescues, each with a name and enough personality to rival most humans. I'd built them a tidy coop in the backyard, approved by the HOA 3 years prior. They were clean, quiet, and loved by every kid on the block. Until Karen arrived. She moved into the colonial next door in a whirlwind of renovation noise and bold declarations. She introduced herself the first day with a gift basket and a warning. I'm the new HOA president, she said, smiling too hard. Things are going to be more elevated around here. I wasn't sure what elevated meant, but I soon found out. New rules appeared weekly, most of them her own invention. Garden gnomes were banned for visual inconsistency. Porch chairs had to be coordinated in tone. A neighbor was fined for hanging wind chimes that disrupted auditory harmony. She was the kind of person who treated power like a sport, and she played to win. I kept my head down. I'd dealt with tougher types in war zones. Karen was just noise in yoga pants. Then came the brunch. It was a Sunday morning in May. I stepped outside to fetch the newspaper, only to find my driveway buried beneath folding tables, white linens, silver chafing dishes, and a hired taco truck belching smoke. A bar cart wobbled dangerously close to my hydrangeas. The sign near the curb read, Willowbrook Welcome Brunch, hosted by HOA President Karen. All residents invited, all except me. Dozens of strangers milled around, sipping mimosas and plucking hors d'oeuvres from skewers shaped like flamingos. Someone leaned against my truck. A child kicked gravel at my duck's enclosure. I walked through the chaos toward Karen, who stood under a parasol laughing with a realtor. Karen, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, why is there a buffet on my driveway? Oh, hi, she chirped, not bothering to look guilty. We needed the extra space. My lawn's all fresh turf, you know? Can't have stiletto holes. This is private property. She sipped her drink. Technically, the HOA has easement rights for community events. It's in the bylaws somewhere. You should be honored, honestly. It's not every day people want to gather here. The word here dropped like an insult disguised in satin. I stared at her, hoping the silence would fill in what words couldn't. She turned back to her conversation as if I'd vanished. I stepped aside and called the sheriff's non-emergency line. An officer arrived 20 minutes later, took one look at the smiling crowd and complimentary shroom cocktails, and told me it was a civil matter. He left with a brownie. By sunset, the party had thinned out, leaving behind overturned cups, oily napkins, and a tablecloth caught in my rosebush. My driveway looked like a wedding had lost a fight with a hurricane. My ducks huddled in the corner of their pen, agitated and unsettled. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the wind scatter paper plates across my lawn. I'd played by every rule in this neighborhood. I'd filed permits, attended meetings, and even voted in that rigged HOA election. I hadn't asked for much, just peace. But now my driveway had become Karen's catering zone, and I was expected to smile and hold the salsa. This wasn't just a trespass. It was a declaration. Karen hadn't just crossed a line. She tap-danced over it with a tray of deviled eggs. She thought I wouldn't fight back. She didn't know about the ducks. The following week, Karen wasted no time. She had found another way to flex her newly acquired power: violation notices. I woke up to a crisp, white envelope pinned to my door. Thick, official-looking. The HOA logo stared back at me with a stern gravitas. I tore it open, half expecting to see a bill for the event space that had once been my driveway. Instead, it was worse. The first violation? Non-compliant livestock. It wasn't the ducks. She had to know that. They were pets, not livestock, and the HOA had already approved their presence years ago, when I'd moved in. The second violation? Non-conforming fencing. She was referring to the modest wooden picket fence I had built to keep my ducks from wandering too far, but apparently it was a visual obstruction in Karen's eyes. I had built it to be low and discreet, barely visible from the street. Yet, somehow it was too much for Karen. She decided my fence was now distracting from the pristine suburban aesthetic she envisioned for Willowbrook Estates. My blood boiled as I read the citations. I didn't need to look up the fines, I knew them. The HOA didn't just issue warnings. No, they had a steep penalty structure designed to make you pay for even thinking about stepping out of line. It was a classic move by someone like Karen. She didn't just want to enforce the rules, she wanted to redefine them to suit her personal agenda. This wasn't about upholding a community standard, it was about control. I couldn't let her get away with this. I had no choice but to fight back. But how? I wasn't the kind of guy to get tangled up in endless HOA meetings, begging for common sense. I knew the system was stacked against me, with Karen at the helm, pulling the strings. So I did what I knew best, I strategized. I walked to the backyard, where my ducks were already waddling around, pecking at the grass. They looked up as I approached, quacking softly and greeting. To anyone else, they were just animals, but to me, they were a tactical advantage. Charlie, the largest of the bunch, was already eyeing the lawnmower, waiting for his turn to supervise it. Mabel was busy doing what she did best, finding trouble. I'd raised them all to be sharp, responsive, and well-trained. I had trained my ducks for years, from basic obedience to advanced tricks. They had assisted at birthday parties, therapy clinics, and school events, providing joy and comfort to everyone they met. But now, they had a new mission. I began drafting my plan. The next HOA meeting was in 2 days, and if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that Karen would be there, smug as ever, eager to put me in my place. I needed to make sure she wouldn't forget who she was messing with. The next morning I got to work. I set up hidden cameras on my property to capture anything she might try to pull. I dug out the old blueprints of the HOA's bylaws from a folder I'd kept, just in case. I read through them carefully, searching for any loophole or angle I could use. I also grabbed a few items from my garage, my old army gear, just in case I needed a reminder of what it felt like to outwit an opponent. But the real weapon? The ducks. I trained them for the next 48 hours. Focused, intense training sessions that pushed them to new limits. Charlie would take the lead. Mabel would disrupt the food. The others would help ensure that nothing went untouched. They wouldn't be mere pets. They would be soldiers in my quiet war against the HOA. It was going to be a spectacle, something Karen would never forget. I watched the clock tick down, knowing that the next confrontation would either make or break me. My ducks were more than pets. They were my last stand. 2 days later, I dressed casually, like any other neighbor, and made my way to the HOA's meeting hall. I knew Karen would be there, holding court with the other residents, pushing her agenda with that sickly sweet smile she reserved for those who didn't question her authority. The room was packed with frustrated homeowners, most of them exhausted from her unrelenting rule. They wanted peace, just like I did. And for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone. As the meeting started, Karen took the floor, launching into her usual spiel about community unity and visual harmony. But as she looked around, she noticed something. It was a quiet sound, like a faint rustle in the background. A familiar quack. I sat back, my heart pounding, knowing my ducks were already in motion. The sound echoed through the HOA meeting room, a low, persistent quacking. At first, it was barely noticeable, like a faint buzzing in the background. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, more urgent, more present. Karen faltered mid-sentence, her sharp gaze scanning the room. "What is that?" she demanded, as the other homeowners turned in confusion. I couldn't help but smile. The ducks had arrived. From a small side door at the back of the hall, I watched as my flock paraded in, one after another, waddling into the room like they owned it. Charlie, as always, led the charge, his beak held high, his chest puffed out in full display of authority. Behind him, Mabel flanked the side, moving with a grace that belied her reputation as the mischief maker. The others trailed in, each one a quiet force of nature, moving as one. It was their moment of glory. The room went still. The homeowners who had been sitting quietly at the long tables exchanged uncertain glances, their jaws dropping in disbelief. Even Karen, the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates, looked momentarily stunned. "What is the meaning of this?" Karen demanded, her voice rising to an almost shrill pitch. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest as I faced the room. The cameras I'd set up earlier caught the chaos, Karen's frantic gestures, the confusion of the neighbors, the ducks wandering freely around the room, pecking at forgotten crumbs, and making themselves at home on the polished floors. "I think it's pretty clear, Karen," I said calmly, striding to the front. My ducks were in full swing now, walking between chairs and under tables. "It's time you learned that not everything here is under your control." Karen's face twisted into a mask of rage, her hands clenched tightly around the podium. "This is outrageous," she shrieked. "You can't just bring animals into a meeting." I raised an eyebrow. "Technically, Karen, you don't control the meeting either. This is a public space, and I'm not breaking any rules." I shot a look at the other homeowners, who were starting to murmur among themselves. "You've ignored the bylaws and the spirit of this neighborhood long enough. It's time someone reminded you how real community works." The other homeowners seemed to wake from their stupor. I saw a few heads nodding. Some looked amused, others looked relieved. I had expected Karen to be the villain in this story, but it seemed the longer she stood there, fumbling to control the situation, the more the residents turned against her. She glared at me, seething. "You've made a mockery of this entire meeting. This is not how you get what you want." Her voice cracked in the effort to maintain authority. I smiled, a knowing grin. "You really think this is about me wanting something, Karen? No, this is about you losing control." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a level only she could hear. "You turned my driveway into a circus, hosted a buffet without permission, and ignored the rights of every resident here. Now, you want to push me out of the community for having a few ducks and a fence? I think it's time you realized that I'm not going anywhere." Karen's face reddened with fury. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, one of my ducks, Charlie, naturally, made his way to the podium. He waddled up to it, his webbed feet tapping the floor with purpose. He stretched his neck and let out a loud, commanding quack, as if to echo my words. The room burst into laughter. Karen's mouth snapped shut. She shot me a look that could have boiled water. Her composure was cracking, and she knew it. I wasn't here for a petty fight over a fence or ducks. I was here to prove a point. Willowbrook Estates wasn't just her playground. The community wasn't just a collection of rules and fines. It was a group of people, each with their own rights and dignity. And if Karen thought she could bully me into submission, she had another thing coming. "Karen," I continued, turning toward the crowd, "this is a community. You're supposed to serve us, not make rules to suit your whims. We have a right to exist here, in our own way, without fear of being punished for every little thing you don't like." The quacking intensified, almost like a chant. The ducks were in on the act now, creating a spectacle that nobody in the room could ignore. Karen, still seething, clenched her fists. "You're going to regret this," she spat. I didn't flinch. "No, Karen," I said, locking eyes with her. "You're going to regret underestimating us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. For the first time in months, it felt like the tide was shifting. People were standing up for what was right. I stepped back, knowing the battle was far from over. But the war had just begun. Karen stood at the front of the room, her fists clenched so tightly that her knuckles were white. She glared at me, the weight of her frustration palpable in the air. The meeting, which had begun with her smug certainty, now seemed to unravel before her eyes. "I won't let this go, you know," Karen said through gritted teeth, her voice barely controlled. "You've made a mockery of this entire community." I stepped forward, the steady rhythm of Charlie's quacking filling the silence. "Funny," I said, "because all I've done is remind people what it feels like to stand up for themselves." Behind me, I could feel the shift in the room. The residents, who had once been passive under Karen's rule, were now leaning forward, their eyes flicking between her and me. Some even smiled, emboldened by the small act of rebellion they'd just witnessed. Karen's authoritarian grip on the neighborhood was starting to slip, and everyone could see it. I'm not the one making a joke out of this place, I continued, my voice calm but firm. You've taken your power too far, Karen. You've ignored the needs of the residents, treated us like your personal chess pieces. Well, the game's over. Karen's face twisted with indignation, but before she could retaliate, I pointed to my ducks, who had finally gathered in a neat line near the front, as if they, too, understood the significance of the moment. Charlie stood at the head, his feathers sleek and glossy. Mabel, ever the troublemaker, nipped at his tail, but he maintained his composure, as if he were the proud general of an army that had just secured its victory. Look at them, Karen, I said, nodding toward my ducks. They're not just pets, they're my reminder that sometimes power comes from the most unexpected places. I may not have your legal jargon or your fancy meetings, but I have something stronger. The support of the people, the strength of my ducks, and the belief that we all deserve a voice. A murmur of agreement ran through the room. The more I spoke, the more I realized that Karen's empire of fines and restrictions was built on fear and submission. But fear, as I knew too well, could only hold sway for so long before it collapsed under the weight of truth. And truth had a way of spreading faster than any HOA rulebook. Karen took a deep breath, her anger simmering but not quite boiling over. You'll regret this, she muttered under her breath, but her eyes no longer carried the same conviction. She was losing her hold, and she knew it. That's enough, Karen. A voice rang out from the back of the room. It was a neighbor I didn't recognize, someone who had been quietly observing the whole exchange. You've pushed us around long enough. One by one, more residents spoke up. They were tired. Tired of being treated like they didn't matter. Tired of Karen's arbitrary rules, her endless fines, and her self-righteous control. Each voice that joined the chorus felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders, and by the time the last person had spoken, the tide had completely turned. The HOA meeting, once a venue for Karen's dominance, had transformed into something unexpected. A rally for change. Karen took another step back, her face now a mixture of defeat and disbelief. The final blow came when one of the older residents, a quiet woman named Mrs. Thompson, who had lived in Willowbrook for over 30 years, stood up and calmly addressed Karen. I think it's time you step down, she said simply. We don't need a tyrant. We need a neighbor. The room fell into a stunned silence. Karen's face flushed, but she said nothing. The wind had been completely knocked out of her sails. After a long, tense moment, she turned on her heel and stalked out of the room, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor. The door slammed behind her with finality, and the room erupted into applause. I smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me like a comforting blanket. The battle was over, and the victory was ours. The HOA had been transformed in that moment. Karen's reign was finished. But there was still work to be done. The bylaws would need to be rewritten. The fines would need to be reevaluated. And most importantly, the residents would need to rebuild the trust that had been shattered by Karen's manipulation. I turned to my ducks, who were now happily exploring the meeting room, pecking at the last of the snacks left behind. Charlie waddled up to me, as if to say, "Job well done." Mabel, ever the mischief maker, darted between my legs, making me laugh. "Thanks, guys," I whispered to them, bending down to ruffle their feathers. "You did good." The ducks didn't need to respond. Their victory was in the air, in the smiles of the neighbors, in the way Karen's face had twisted in frustration. They'd done their part, and so had I. As I walked out of the meeting room, my neighbors gathered around me, offering congratulations and cheers. We had stood up together, united by the simple truth that a community thrives on respect, not control. And as long as my ducks were around, I was ready to remind anyone who forgot that lesson.